everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 13th, where we are talking about Dracula. We made it through approximately halfway through the book. I had indicated that I think of it as separate novels, that might be an easier way to deal with the text that's so long. And what I call book 3, which would be chapters 18 through 23, would be basically the mystery novel, Mina's mystery in this instance. And in chapter 17, we're introduced to Mina as a researcher who basically is compiling evidence. She shows throughout the novel just how capable she is, and yet she is excluded by the men, and that's one of the reasons why she becomes vulnerable to Dracula. It's interesting how all of these characters get to know one another through technology, through journals and letter writing and so forth. Again, it almost reminds me of how social media is a way that we tend to get to know one another and connect with one another. As much as things change, they remain the same. And some interesting quotes, one being that Mina says, "We women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters." And certainly you get this idea of the contrast of the two women, the very common trope of the whore, the Madonna. And Mina is very much in the Madonna category. Now that Lucy has basically been subjected to the whore category. After all, she was contemplating 3 suitors at the same time, 3 being such an important number because it suggests Trinity, much like we saw with Dracula's 3 wives, though this would be a upside down kind of Trinity, an unholy Trinity, if you will. So in chapter 18, we get some Christian references, such as the scriptural phrase, "the blood is the life." And of course, blood is used symbolically through wine in Christian celebrations and religious ceremonies. And one of the ideas behind serial killers like Madame Bathory, which we had talked about from the 1500s, is that the blood would be a kind of rejuvenating force. Van Helsing at one point, in an attempt to praise Mina, says that she has a man's brain and a woman's heart. And again, I think you can see some of the stereotypes in this novel, not just with Mina, but also with Quincy Morris, with Bram Stoker trying to imagine what an American, and a Texan American at that, would sound like. Some of his dialogue is absolutely absurd. It strikes me that it's Quincy in chapter 18 that shoots a vampire bat. Not only is this foreshadowing, but it establishes that Quincy, and by association Americans as a whole, tend to be rash. So I think there definitely is this anti-American statement that is subtly embedded within the text. In chapter 19 is where we get our climax. It's no surprise that it happens in October. We know that in the Gothic tradition that ultimately the fall is supposed to represent the beginning of descent, and it also is associated with Halloween, which is when the veil is thinnest between the living and the dead. Renfield is consuming higher level life forms. He's moved from flies to now spiders. Of course, the idea is that he's moving his way up the food chain in an attempt to emulate Dracula, who ultimately is consuming humans, specifically British females. And again, one of the anxieties that's embedded within this particular text is the idea of Dracula as outsider or other, foreigner, if you will, invading England and particularly contaminating English women through the contamination of the blood, the dilution, basically, of the blood. Now, the men isolate Mina. Again, I think that's very much one of the reasons why this text is perhaps not necessarily as progressive as it could be. And as we continue on, Quincy is the one who rashly chases the vampire, again, sort of reinforcing that stereotype. And Mina drinks Dracula's blood. There's a little bit of a role reversal here. Now, it's going to be necessary as a plot device in order so that she can get an inner insight into what Dracula's thoughts happen to be. But the idea of sucking and drinking Of course, that's referenced by all of the appetite references, as I was suggesting earlier. But now Mina is presented as aggressor in that particular instance. And then what we get, what I call book 4, which is an adventure novel in effect, chapters 22 through 27. I think this was a very clever technique of Bram Stoker's, is to give us all these different genres so that it could appeal to a wider audience. In chapter 22, Jonathan, very nobly, vows to join Mina as a vampire. I believe I had mentioned last class how little we get of the vampire story. It's something that contemporary authors such as Anne Rice were able to take advantage of. Chapter 23, we're told more is at stake, and of course lots of punning with counting and staking. Lots of winks and nods in this novel. And chapter 24, Mina talks about how brave and strong the men may be, but she may be of service. You know, and Mina is a complicated character in some ways. She's quite independent, but then in other ways, she also is quite passive. So talking about gender in any of these texts would be an interesting paper topic. And yes, I am working my way through paper number 1, and I'm hopeful that you're beginning to think about paper number 2, which is going to be very similar to paper number 1, as you would have seen in the paper topics that I had put in syllabus and other documents, that both paper number 1 and paper number 2 are critical papers. In other words, you shouldn't be consulting outside resources, and that they are both approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but as long or as short as you need them to be. And that the topic that I've suggested to you is to talk about the Emily Dickinson quote about one need not be a chamber to be haunted in relation to one of the texts that we've studied this semester. Paper number 1 in reference to one of the earlier texts, and then paper number 2 in reference to one of the later texts. So it might be that Dracula might be the text that you decide to examine for paper number 2, but we have other authors coming up as well. Dracula is probably, if you're thinking about the class as a kind of hill, we're at perhaps the top of the hill, in the sense that Dracula might be one of the more challenging reads just because of its length. And again, the language is a little bit antiquated compared to what we've come to expect in contemporary times. But once we start moving beyond Dracula, you'll see that we will read a little bit of Lovecraft. And we started the semester with H.P. Lovecraft when we were talking about his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. We talked a little bit about some of the criteria from his perspective that are so important in terms of the Gothic and supernatural. And I wanted us to be able to read a little bit of his works and see if he was practicing what he was preaching. And I've included some links, much like I always do when I'm able to find them. I had ordered a text of Lovecraft's short stories. Not that we're reading all of the short stories in that particular text. I've just selected a few for us to discuss just so that you could get a little bit of a taste. After that, we get into much more contemporary pieces. I think you'll find that the work after that, The Haunting of Hill House, is certainly shorter and is certainly easier, just in terms of more contemporary language. So if you're not yet inspired for paper number 2, keep in mind that there are some more modern texts that are coming up. But to go back to Dracula, in chapter 25, Mina says, the Count is a criminal and a criminal type. Again, I think that is also in reference to the idea of foreigner and other, oftentimes put into that stereotypical box. And in chapter 26, I can't help but snicker when it turns out that Quincy Morris is being left behind with Mina because he's the only one who doesn't speak any foreign languages. Again, I think a little dig at Americans and that they tend to be monolingual rather than bilingual or trilingual. Chapter 27, Quincy does die to save Mina. You can say that that's an act of heroism, but you could also see it as Stoker sacrificing, again, the character that is perhaps the most problematic, Lucy, initially, because of possible sexual proclivities. We could even say that she is a bit loose, hence her name, Lucy. And now Quincy, the foreigner, the outsider, the American. But we do get a happy ending. Jonathan and Mina's son happens to be born on the anniversary of Quincy's death, and is basically a mixture of all of the names of all of the vampire hunters. But they also acknowledge at the very end the sense of ambiguity, which is something that we've become accustomed to in the world of the Gothic as well. That there are no real authentic documents. Oh, there's lots of newspaper clippings and journal entries and so forth, but there's no definitive proof. So even something like Dracula, where we've got a clear supernatural element through the vampire, is very clearly shown to have ambiguous elements within it. Perhaps one of the most important things about Dracula is that it helps to establish the vampire myth that we've become so accustomed to. We have all of the criteria laid out to all of the elements associated with vampire. And that said, I think that if you were to ask most people on the street, they would basically tell you a lot of the vampire lore that we are introduced to in chapter 18, specifically pages 243 through 246, at least in the edition that I had ordered for us in class, about the powers and the weaknesses associated with vampires. And Stoker would have used a lot of the myth that had already existed in folklore, but nowhere before had it all been compiled in one area. Now, one of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to is the third section in the notes below. You'll see a link that I think is quite interesting. It's called Dracula Daily. And now that hopefully you have concluded reading Dracula, you could see that it's quite easy to read the novel in real time, because the novel basically takes place over about a year. Not that we have that kind of time in order to read Dracula, but Dracula Daily is a website that will send you an entry via email on a daily basis on the date in which that particular entry was made in Dracula. So you could read it over the course of a year in real time if you so wanted to. What I wanted to talk about next class were some of the Dracula quotations and some of the themes within the novel. And then we can move to Lovecraft, as I had indicated. And the stories I wanted to focus on were stories that had some sort of a supernatural element, or at least the possibility of supernatural associated with them, because that really does seem to be the thing that's binding all of our texts together this semester. The Outsider, Pickman's Model, and the Dunwich Horror. And I've included links where you can find those online for free, but I've also included the page numbers, at least with the addition of the text that I had ordered. And hopefully, since that's a shorter reading, that'll allow you to catch your breath, because I do know that Dracula is a long read. And ultimately, that means that we will move forward to The Haunting of Hill House. Again, I was able to find a link so that you could read it online if you so wanted to. And The Haunting of Hill House is very much in the tradition of the English ghost story. So we talked a little bit about Monkey's Paw during our Halloween presentation, and we'll revisit that when we talk about the English ghost story, Monkey's Paw also being an example of English ghost story with subtlety and establishing mood. We'll also see that Hill House is very much personified, and you probably will think of things like The Fall of the House of Usher. We're at the point of the semester now where you can make references to some of the earlier texts. So as I had indicated, I'm trying to catch up. I'm going through your papers, and all of you have the option of revising that paper for a higher grade. So once you receive it from me with my commentary, I ask that if you are going to do a revision, that you submit in the revision along with my original graded commentary with my comments, and you would have the higher of the two grades. You have up until the last day of class in which to do that, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. And I also intend to not only catch up with those papers in the next week or so, but also catch up with the attendance questions as well. I can warn you right now that after Thanksgiving, I've found that the semester just tends to fly. So be forewarned that what seems like a slow, leisurely pace will probably pick up rather considerably. As you know, your second paper is due at the ending of the semester. There wouldn't be time for you to revise it, but the idea is that you would have learned through the exercise of writing the first paper how to write the second paper. So therefore, there wouldn't be a need for a revision. I'll also start soon talking about the final examination, which is going to be open book, open notes. And if we were taking a face-to-face class, that would be a 2-hour exam. Since this is a online class, you have 24 hours with which to complete that exam, and I'll give you several essay topics and ask you to respond to some within that list. So basically, it would be very similar to writing a paper. The difference would be that rather than 2 weeks, you would have approximately 24 hours or so to work on it. Not that I expect you to spend 24 hours. Again, I would expect that you would spend approximately 2 hours, which is what we would do in a face-to-face class. And the best way to prepare for the final is basically to have done all of the readings in the semester, to have watched all of the class videos, to have read all of the discussion forum responses. So you know you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And as I indicated, I plan on spending this week trying to catch up as much as possible so that you'll all have responses to that as well. So, if you haven't had an opportunity to finish Dracula, this is the time to finish Dracula for certain. And it also is the time to get ahead with thinking about H.P. Lovecraft and also The Haunting of Hill House, which Stephen King talks a little bit about, and Danse Macabre as well. And while his book that I've ordered for class focuses on the 3 perhaps seminal Gothic texts, Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, Stephen King is the first to admit that The Haunting of Hill House is right up there as well. So we'll also talk about film versions of The Haunting of Hill House. So what's left for today is your thinking about our discussion forum response, which would be due on Wednesday, the 15th. And I'd like to know what you found to be the most surprising element about the novel Dracula and why. So I'm hopeful that at this point you've either finished the novel or you are close to finishing the novel. I'll talk about some quotations from the novel next class, and then we will begin with Lovecraft. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.